Okay, let's jump in. We started this deep dive hoping to really get under the skin of ancient politics, the backroom deals, the power plays, maybe even find some solid evidence of outright corruption.
Right, we were looking for that kind of insider track on the classical world's less savory side.
Exactly.
But, you know, as often happens, the sources pulled us in a broader direction. Yes, those elements are definitely there, but it's not just about scandals in isolation.
It's bigger than that.
It really is.
Yeah.
We ended up looking at this vast, interconnected system. We're really digging into the fundamental challenges these societies faced. How they dealt with existential threats, how they kept things structured.
And how they wrestled with these huge questions. Who counts as free? Who's considered property? And crucially, who gets to be above the law?
Precisely. So we're moving from these almost legendary battlefields, the ones that, frankly, saved Greece from being swallowed whole.
Yeah, the big turning points.
All the way to the incredibly dense, sometimes almost obsessive details of Roman legal structures, the stuff that really formed the bedrock of their society.
It paints this picture of a world where everything was high stakes. Your life, your death, your whole future could hinge on, I don't know, a perfectly timed naval maneuver.
Or just as easily on some really specific, maybe even pedantic-sounding clause buried deep inside somebody's will.
It's that level of detail.
Our exploration today is going to connect those dots. We'll link those battlefield decisions, the ones that really shape the outcome of something like the Persian Wars, to these profound legal paradoxes you see in Roman life around slavery, property, citizenship.
And we'll see again and again how power, war, and law were just constantly intersected.
And almost always how self-interest, individual or group ambition constantly threaten to just tear these societies apart from the inside.
So, our mission for you listening in is to pull out those surprising nuggets of insight. We want to equip you with the strategic background, a real sense of the political betrayals, and an understanding of the incredibly complex rules that governed everything from who owned what land to who even counted as a person in Greece and Rome.
You get ready to really understand the gravity of the decisions being made back then. It was a high-stakes world.
Okay, let's start where a lot of ancient history kicks off that moment of absolute crisis for the Greeks. I'm talking about the period right after the disaster at Thermopylae, 480 BC. Xerxes has smashed through the northern defenses.
Yeah, and the fallout is immediate. It's devastating for anyone in his path.
It's like dominoes falling.
Pretty much. That stand at Thermopylae, heroic as it was, and the earlier strategic decision to abandon the defensive line at Tempe, it basically opened the floodgates. Xerxes just poured straight into central Greece.
Through Locris, Phocis.
Right into Boeotia. And faced with this just massive, unstoppable Persian army, what could states like Thebes or most of the other Boeotians really do?
Not much, I imagine.
Their only viable option, as they saw it, was submission. So effectively, the central Greek states were neutralized, taken off the board.
And it's during this terrifying advance, isn't it, that we get one of the most famous stories, almost legendary, the attempted plunder of Delphi.
Yes. The sources almost make it sound like Xerxes himself was personally invested in this, maybe recalling intelligence his father Darius gathered, knowing the shrine's treasures better than his own, as Herodotus puts it.
It's quite a claim.
It is. And the story itself, it's spectacular, clearly built to inspire Greek morale when things look bleakest.
So what happened? The Delphians fled.
Most did, yeah, up the slopes of Mount Parnassus. But they did something, well, extraordinary. They refused to move the sacred treasury. They left just this tiny contingent, maybe 60 men, and the prophet Assaratus.
Trusting the god.
Absolutely trusting Apollo's word that he would protect his own shrine. Pure faith in the face of overwhelming force.
And then things get supernatural.
You could say that. As the Persian detachment sent to loot the temple gets close, near the shrine of Athena Pronia, the first sign happens. These sacred weapons, arms so holy no mortal was supposed to touch them.
Yes.
They're suddenly seen moving by themselves, out of the inner chamber onto the path, right in front of the advancing Persians.
Okay, that's dramatic.
And it escalates. Lightning starts flashing down, terrifying the invaders. Then, even more dramatically, two huge crags, massive boulders, break off clean from the peaks of Parnassus.
Wow.
They roll down and just crush scores of the Persian soldiers. The account even mentions this huge war cry erupting from Athena's temple. Divine intervention, loud and clear.
And wasn't there something about ghostly warriors, too?
That's the final touch, the shift into pure epic. The appearance of two superhuman hoplites, spectral figures, identified as local heroes, Phylacus and Autonus. Their appearance completely terrified the remaining Persians, sending them into a full panicked retreat.
So whether it's literal fact or brilliant propaganda.
Exactly. That story, the saving of Delphi, it sent this incredibly powerful message across Greece. Divine power was on their side, even when their armies were defeated on the battlefield. Hugely important for morale.
While the gods were supposedly busy defending Delphi, the Athenians were dealing with much more earthly problems. Betrayal, basically.
That's right. Their fleet gets back from the naval action up at Artemisium, which is more of a strategic stalemate, really. And the Athenian leadership, with Themistocles at the forefront, they discover this harsh reality.
What was it?
The main Peloponnesian army, the Spartans and their allies, they hadn't marched north like they were supposed to. They weren't defending Boeotia, let alone Attica.
So where were they?
They were completely focused on saving their own skins, feverishly building a fortified wall right across the Isthmus of Corinth.
Sealing off the Peloponnese.
Exactly. Effectively abandoning central Greece, including Athens, to Xerxes. This forced the Athenians into that devastating decision to evacuate their own city.
Just imagine that, the logistical nightmare, the emotional trauma, everyone packing up, getting on ships.
Yeah, women and children mostly shipped off to relative safety in Troezen, Aegina, Salamis. It wasn't some orderly move. It was a desperate flight for survival.
And the Areopagus Council played a role.
Our sources actually highlight that. The Venerable Council of Areopagus stepped up. They took on this really practical administrative role, distributing crucial funds, get this from the treasury of Athena herself,
Using sacred money.
for humanitarian aid and, implicitly, military necessity. It shows how extreme the crisis was, that they dip into the goddess's funds to manage this mass evacuation.
Then comes maybe the lowest point politically. The second Persian occupation of Attica. Mardonius is in charge now for Xerxes.
Right, Mardonius reoccupies the land. And he makes this very clever, calculated move initially. He leaves Attica completely unravaged.
Why? What was the strategy there?
He was playing the long game. Mardonius knew the Athenians held the key, especially their powerful navy. If he could just convince Athens, feeling abandoned, betrayed by their allies, to switch sides.
The whole Greek resistance collapses.
Precisely. That isthmus wall becomes instantly irrelevant. So he sends these insidious, tempting offers to the Athenians, who are now refugees on Salamis.
And despite everything being homeless, their land occupied, bitterly disappointed in their allies.
They held firm. It's actually one of the most remarkable moments. They absolutely rejected Mardonius's offer. Their steadfastness, especially under that kind of pressure, is maybe the most crucial political nugget from this whole period.
But just being steadfast wasn't enough to get the Spartans moving, was it?
Not at all. Athens, along with delegates from Megara and Plataea, had to send a specific formal embassy down to Sparta, demanding immediate military action against Mardonius in Attica.
And the Spartan response?
Oh, it was peak Spartan obstinacy, just pure self-interest. They stalled. They put off giving any answer for 10 whole days.
10 days. Why?
Their excuse was a major religious festival, the Hyacinthia, which sounds suspiciously like the excuse they used the year before the Carnia festival to delay marching to Thermopylae.
So, same playbook. They felt safe behind their wall.
Utterly secure. They figured the Isthmus fortification had them covered. And what happened to Athens was, well, secondary. A catastrophic political miscalculation, frankly. This narrow Peloponnesian focus almost doomed the entire Greek cause.
Until someone managed to break through that complacency. Not a Spartan, right?
No, that's the fascinating part. It took an outsider, Chilios of Tegea, a respected allied leader, to finally shake them out of it.
What did he say? What was the argument that finally landed?
Chilios pointed out the glaring, fatal flaw in their entire strategy, the one they'd somehow overlooked in their self-satisfaction. He argued, very simply, if the Athenians, pushed to absolute desperation by Spartan inaction, did accept Mardonius's offer,
And added their fleet to the Persian side.
then that precious Isthmian wall, the one the Spartans were banking everything on, would be rendered absolutely useless.
Because the Persians could just sail around it.
Exactly. They could bypass the wall by sea, land armies anywhere they wanted in the Peloponnese. Suddenly, it wasn't about saving Athens. It was about saving themselves.
So it wasn't appeals to loyalty or morality. It was cold, hard, strategic reality hitting home.
That's what worked. The direct threat to their own territory, pointed out by an ally, Sparta did an immediate 180. They dispatched this unprecedentedly huge force.
How big?
5,000 Spartan citizens, each with a helot attendant, plus another 5,000 Periosi non-citizen free inhabitants of Laconia, each also with one helot. 10,000 hoplites, plus 10,000 support troops. Doubling the usual citizen levy with helots showed just how seriously they finally took the threat once they realized it affected them.
It's striking how seamlessly we can shift from this massive international conflict to internal Athenian politics, because, as you said, the dynamics feel disturbingly similar. Betrayal, self-interest, the abuse of power.
They absolutely defined life within Athens, just as much as they shaped interactions between the Greek states.
So let's pivot. We're moving past the Peloponnesian War now into that really brutal period, the oligarchic reign of the 30 tyrants in Athens.
Yes, 404 BC. This was an internal threat, which in many ways is even more terrifying. The danger wasn't from Persia, it was from your fellow Athenians.
And this oligarchy, it wasn't exactly stable, was it?
Not at all. They were facing external pressure almost immediately. Their attempt to blockade Phyle, this key fortress near Athens, failed. It had been seized by exiled Democrats led by figures like Thrasybulus and Ambitus.
But they also had enemies within their own ranks.
Critically, yes. Theramenes. He was a major figure, but complicated.
He had that nickname, right? The Buskin.
Exactly. Kathornos in Greek. The idea was it's a loose boot, fits either foot, meaning he was seen as an opportunist, someone who could shift his political stance depending on who was in power.
Which would make him dangerous to the hardliners?
Especially to the most ruthless leader of the 30, Critias. Critias saw Theramenes, who kind of represented a more moderate faction and clearly had significant support, as someone who had to be eliminated. Not just politically sidelined, but physically removed.
So Critias went after him.
Directly. He launched this aggressive public denunciation right before the governing council, accusing Theramenes point blank of being a traitor, a conspirator against the oligarchy.
But Theramenes fought back.
He did. He gave a strong defense, turning the tables, denouncing the 30's tyrannical actions. And here's where you see a flicker of the old democratic process, even under the oligarchy.
What happened?
The sources suggest the council was actually persuaded by Theramenes. They applauded him. It looked like they were ready to acquit him, which could have triggered a major political shift, maybe even the fall of the hardliners.
So the popular will, even in that diminished council, almost won out.
Almost. But that very applause, that sign of support for Theramenes, sealed his fate. Critias saw he couldn't win legally or politically.
So she resorted to force.
And a chillingly effective bureaucratic maneuver, basically a legal coup. He called in his armed guards who surrounded the council, and then he personally, physically, struck Theramenes' name off the official register, the list of the 3,000.
Okay, wait, the list of the 3,000. Why was being on that specific list so incredibly important?
Because only citizens whose names were on that specific, carefully maintained list of the 3,000 privileged individuals could claim the right to a trial before the council or the popular assembly.
So, by striking his name.
Critias instantly stripped Theramenes of all legal protections. In that moment, despite being right there in the council chamber arguing his case, he became an outlaw. No due process required.
That's terrifying. How did the council react?
They were described as being stupefied with terror. They saw exactly what was happening, this naked abusive procedure backed by armed force. Critias didn't hesitate. He immediately ordered the executioners, the group known as the 11, to drag Theramenes away from the sacred hearth of the council chamber, where he'd sought sanctuary, and execute him on the spot.
Wow. It's just the rawest example of how elite power, combined with manipulating the rules, can completely override justice. Legalized murder, basically.
That's exactly what it was.
Okay, we've seen law's fragility in Athens during crisis. Let's cross over to Rome now. Because there, law wasn't seen as this fragile thing, was it? It was more like foundational, almost religious in its importance.
That's a good way to put it. Our sources really emphasize this. For the Romans, jurisprudence, the study and practice of law, wasn't just a job. It was one of the 3 great intellectual disciplines.
Alongside philosophy and science.
Exactly. Metaphysical inquiry, physical science, and law. These were the big fields that occupied the Roman mind. Especially for the Latin-speaking world, law was this intensive, continuous, highly specialized mental exercise. It just dominated their intellectual landscape.
So even an ordinary person, a layman, would understand why so much brain power went into law.
They might not grasp all the technicalities, but yeah, they'd certainly understand why, as one source puts it. An unusual share of the collective intellect of Rome was engrossed by jurisprudence. It was the absolute engine of statecraft and social order.
And this deep respect for legal form, it extended even to the emperor, right? Even with all that concentrated power.
Remarkably, yes. Even the emperor himself, the supreme ruler, didn't just rule by might. Formally, legally, He was given his imperium, his actual power to command, to govern, to execute by law.
So there's always this idea of a legal basis, even for what looks like absolute rule.
It emphasized that supreme power, even when it was practically absolute, was understood to derive, at least notionally, from a legal grant originating with the Roman people or the Senate acting on their behalf.
And the law itself wasn't simple. It wasn't just one book of rules.
Oh, absolutely not. It was this incredibly complex, layered system that was constantly evolving over centuries. Roman legislation came from all sorts of different sources.
Like what?
Well, you had leges, which were laws passed by the popular assemblies, the comitia. Then there were plebiscites, resolutions from the plebeian council. You had senatus consults, which were technically advice from the Senate, but often had the force of law.
And the emperors themselves.
Imperial constitutions, edicts, decrees, letters issued directly by the emperor, plus edicts issued by magistrates like praetors. And crucially, you had the responsa prudentium, the scholarly opinions and answers given by the most learned legal experts, the ius parity.
So a real mix of sources.
A very complex mix. It ensured that legal structure, process, and precedent were valued above almost everything else.
It's also worth remembering this move away from kings, from lifelong rulers, wasn't unique to Rome, was it?
No, the sources point this out. Abolishing the life tenure of the presidency, or monarchy, was seen as a necessary step across the whole Italo-Grecian world back then. It was superseded pretty much everywhere by annual magistrates, like the Roman consuls.
A way to prevent too much power building up in one person's hands.
Exactly. That shift towards limited yearly executive power was a common trajectory.
Right.
It was designed specifically to prevent the kind of destabilizing, long-term power accumulation that monarchy represented.
And yet, within this highly ordered legal framework, Rome had to manage this enormous, glaring contradiction: slavery.
Yes, it's one of the great paradoxes of Rome. They practiced enslavement on a truly colossal scale. It fueled their economy, their military expansion, everything.
But at the same time,
Paradoxically, they also freed slaves, manumitted them in really substantial numbers. And here's the key difference, especially compared to many Greek states. Those freed persons, liberti, often automatically became Roman citizens.
that's huge. That policy of inclusion integrating freed people right into the citizen body.
It's often cited as a major factor in Rome's success. This willingness to expand citizenship, to absorb former slaves, was a powerful recipe for growth, for consolidating conquest, for building loyalty. Roman citizenship, unlike, say, Athenian citizenship, was deliberately expansive.
Why did they free so many slaves? What were the motivations?
It varied a lot, and often reasons overlapped. Simple affection was definitely one. You see it commemorated sometimes, quite touchingly, on tombstones, especially between masters and younger female slaves, it seems.
There's data on that.
Yeah. Studies of manumission records, like those from the sanctuary at Delphi, where formal manumissions were recorded, show a noticeably high proportion of females being granted freedom. Suggests personal relationships played a big role.
What about more formal reasons?
Well, formal legal marriage between a mazgu and his freedwoman was common and legally recognized. That created new family ties across that social divide. And very practically, wills often included legacies, specifically providing for the benefit or future maintenance of ex-slaves. Manumission was often part of long-term planning for wealthy households.
Let's look at the legal status itself, the word servian for slaves.
The Romans themselves derived it, maybe a bit self-servingly, from the verb servere, meaning to preserve. The idea was that generals sold prisoners of war, thus preserving their lives instead of killing them.
A convenient justification.
Perhaps. They were also called mancipia, which comes from manus, hand, and capere, to take, meaning captured by hand. But here's a critical point, especially compared to later systems of slavery.
Yes.
Roman slavery wasn't generally based on nature or distinct racial characteristics. Slaves looked like Romans. This structural reality made the transition, legally and socially, much easier. A freed slave could quite easily become the free parent of fully free Roman citizens in the next generation.
Which brings us to the philosophical angle. The Stoics were influential, right? How did they view slavery?
This is where it gets really interesting and contradictory. Stoic philosophy, which was very popular among the Roman elite, basically argued that legal slavery was just an external condition. It affected your body, your legal status, but it had no real spiritual significance.
So true slavery wasn't about chains.
For the Stoics, true slavery was moral. It meant being at the mercy of your own desires, your passions, your vices. That was the real bondage. Legal status, just an external circumstance.
Which creates this huge tension, doesn't it? If the elite philosophers are minimizing the importance of legal slavery.
Why did their entire economic system rely so fundamentally on it? Yeah, it's a profound contradiction. Economically, though, the answer seems pretty pragmatic, based on our sources.
Landowners just preferred slaves?
Often, yes. They argued slaves were more profitable, maybe cheaper, though some modern scholars question the pure economic efficiency argument. But a huge factor was simply availability.
What do you mean?
Large landowners often couldn't find enough free smallholders to work their estates. Why? Because so many Roman citizens were constantly being called away for mandatory, long-term military service.
Leaving a massive labor gap.
Exactly, a gap that imported slave labor readily filled. And of course, this reliance on slave labor then further contributed to the economic decline of those very free peasant families. It was a vicious cycle.
Okay, let's dive deeper into the legal weeds. Roman property law, inheritance, the testamentum, the will. The complexity here really shows that Roman obsession with procedure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
To even make a valid Roman will, you needed a specific legal capacity called seis commerci, the full right to engage in Roman commerce, essentially.
Oh, didn't have that.
Well, it immediately excluded certain groups. People declared interdicted prodigals, basically, those deemed legally incompetent to manage their own money. Generally, peregrini foreigners lacked it, although Latins often had special agreements granting them this right. Having seis commerci was the baseline for being able to dispose of your property after death.
And there were physical disabilities that could prevent someone from making a will, too.
Yes, and they were incredibly specific, tied directly to the inability to perform the required legal rituals of making a will.
Such as?
A person who was mute, for instance, couldn't make a will because they couldn't physically utter the occupatio. That was the formal oral declaration of the will that had to be spoken aloud before witnesses.
Okay, what about a deaf person?
They were excluded because they couldn't hear the necessary declaration made by another key figure in the older will-making ceremony, the familiae emptor.
Right, the familiae emptor. What exactly was that role again? It sounds like family buyer.
That's literally what it means, purchaser of the family property.
Right.
In the really early ritualistic form of the Roman will, called the testamentum per eis et librum, by bronze and scale, the testator would perform a symbolic sale of his entire estate, his familia, to this third party, the familiae emptor.
Using scales and a coin.
Exactly. It was a formal legal fiction representing the transfer of the estate according to the testator's instructions, which were often written on tablets sealed by witnesses.
Yeah.
Even though it became symbolic later, the formal presence and declaration of this purchaser remained essential for validity. So if you couldn't hear him, you couldn't participate fully in the ritual.
Makes sense in a very procedural way. And obviously, lacking intellect as sound mind would rule you out too.
Predictably, yes. People considered insane or minors below the age of puberty couldn't make a valid will.
Now, the rules for women making wills, they sound particularly restrictive, revealing a lot about the patriarchal structure.
They were, especially before Emperor Hadrian reformed things in the 2nd century AD. Until then, a will made by a free-born woman, an ingenua, unless she happened to be a Vestal virgin, who had special privileges required, clearing two significant procedural hurdles.
What was the first?
She usually needed to undergo a coemptio. That's the same kind of symbolic purchase ceremony we just talked about with the familiae emptor, but here it was often used to legally transfer her from one form of male guardianship, tutela, to another, specifically to enable the will.
Why? What was the coemptio protecting in the context of a woman's will?
It was explicitly designed as a safeguard for her agnates.
Agnates. Remind us who they are.
Your agnates are your close relatives connected only through the male line, father, brothers, paternal uncles, nephews through brothers, and so on. These were the people who would have inherited her property by default if she died without a will intestate.
So the coemptio was there to make sure she couldn't easily cut them out.
Essentially, yes. It was a procedural check meant to prevent her from, in the eyes of the law, improperly disinheriting her traditional male family line, ensuring that family wealth stayed within that agnatic lineage as much as possible. It reinforced the traditional power structure.
Okay, that was the first hurdle. What was the second?
She also needed the formal approval, the auctoritas, of her legal guardian or tutor.
Could she force him to give it?
Often, yes. She could compel her appointed tutor to grant his authority unless, and this is a key exception, that tutor was her patron, if she was a freedwoman, or her parent's manumissor, the father who had emancipated her from his own power.
Why those exceptions?
Because those specific relationships Patron freedwoman, father emancipated daughter involved special duties of respect and potential inheritance rights for the tutor. The law wouldn't let her compel them to approve an action that might harm their own interests. It shows how meticulously Roman law tried to balance giving women some control while preserving specific, powerful familial relationships.
The legal status of slaves obviously complicated inheritance even more, especially when it came to them acquiring things.
Absolutely. Consider this scenario. A slave is acting in good faith, maybe mistakenly believing they are free. If that person formally accepts an inheritance,
Yeah.
they cannot legally acquire that inheritance for their actual master. Why? Because the whole transaction was based on the false premise of freedom, invalidating the intended transfer of property to the owner.
Interesting. What about a slave whose master didn't fully own them, but just had the right to use them?
You mean like a usufruct?
Yeah.
Right. If a slave was held only in usufruct, meaning the master had the right to use the slave and take their earnings, but someone else held the underlying ownership,
Yeah.
that slave could not acquire property, like an inheritance, for the benefit of the usufructuary master. Any such acquisition would go to the actual underlying owner of the slave. That distinction between use right and ownership was critical.
And slaves owned by the state, by the emperor's treasury.
That was a special case, where the lines got a bit blurry. A slave belonging to the imperial treasury, the fiscus, actually could accept an inheritance, but only if they received specific instructions to do so from the imperial procurator, the financial agent in charge. It highlights the unique legal position of imperial property. It wasn't quite private, not quite public, operating under its own set of rules.
Okay, one last complex Roman legal concept here. Ademption, removing something from a will.
Right. A legacy, a specific gift in a will, or a fidia commissum, which is like a trust, could be formally removed or redeemed if the testator later clearly expressed a change of heart, usually in a subsequent will or codicil.
But what if they didn't formally change the will? What if they just started hating the person they'd left money to?
The law had to grapple with that too, implied ademption. If a really serious mortal enmity arose between the testator and the beneficiary after the will was made.
Serious hatred.
Yes, not just a trivial quarrel, but deep-seated, justifiable hostility. In those cases, the fide commissum might be legally regarded as having been implicitly deemed, canceled, even without a formal written change. It shows that even within the incredibly formal Roman system, profound changes in personal relationships could sometimes override the written word in court.
Okay, so we've seen the value placed on law in both Athens and Rome. But how did that ideal actually hold up in the courtroom, in the messy reality of litigation? Let's go back to Athens first. Their radical democracy really emphasized equality before the law, protecting the private sphere.
That was the ideology, absolutely. But in practice, the Athenian system faced constant criticism and, frankly, instability. Thinkers like Plato and Aristotle were sharp critics.
What was their main complaint?
They described the democracy as potentially undisciplined and lawless. Their big fear was that the popular assembly, the demos, could just vote to override established laws whenever it felt like it.
Mob rule, essentially.
That was the danger they saw. A system where the whim of the majority in the moment could trump stable, written legislation. Aristotle was particularly worried about the accountability mechanisms.
Like the euthanae, the lawsuits against officials after they left office.
Exactly. He argued that while these were meant to keep magistrates honest, the constant threat of politically motivated lawsuits led to paralysis, the overturning of all the magistracies, as he put it. Good people wouldn't want to serve if they knew they'd likely face prosecution, possibly ruin afterwards.
So the law itself became a political weapon.
Very much so, which makes the Athenian courtroom this intensely competitive arena. It was truly agonistic, a contest, a struggle, and often rhetorical skill. How well you could persuade the massive citizen juries mattered more than hard facts.
Why was persuasion so central?
Because proving things definitively was really hard back then. They didn't have forensic science, reliable record-keeping was patchy. So what did litigants and their speechwriters, the logographoi, do?
Attack the opponent.
Constantly. They'd spend huge amounts of time denigrating their opponent's reputation, their moral character, their entire life history, their very status as a trustworthy citizen. The trial wasn't just about the specific accusation, it was about the whole person.
So juries ended up judging the person, not just the case.
To a large extent, yes. Faced with conflicting stories and limited proof, those hundreds of jurors often had to fall back on a general holistic judgment. Which of these two litigants seems like the more credible, reputable Athenian, whose life story makes them more believable? Winning often meant winning the character battle.
And lurking beneath all this, there's the brutal reality of how some evidence was gathered, the role of torture.
Yeah, that's the stark contrast.
Yeah.
Athenian citizens had this absolute protection. They could not be legally subjected to torture to extract testimony. That was a fundamental privilege of citizenship.
What's slave?
For slaves, it was the standard procedure. Testimony from slaves, especially in serious cases, was typically obtained under torture. It highlights this deep institutionalized inequality right at the heart of Athenian life, even though, paradoxically, many slaves held really responsible positions: managers, bankers, administrators.
Turning to Rome, we see a different kind of inequality, one that became more formalized in the legal system itself, especially later on.
Definitely. By the 2nd, 3rd centuries AD, there's a very clear trend towards a two-tiered justice system. Penalties became much harsher overall.
And the key distinction was,
Whether you're humiliores, lower status free persons, or honestiores, the elite. What's really significant is that sanctions previously reserved almost exclusively for slaves started being applied to the humiliores.
like, what kind of punishments?
Things like forced labor in the mines or quarries, crucifixion, being thrown to the beasts in the arena. Punishments that were once unthinkable for a free Roman citizen became commonplace for the lower classes. Your free status offered less and less protection if you didn't have wealth or connections.
While the honestiores, the elites, they got special treatment.
They absolutely did. The legal system developed explicit concepts of status and privilege that often shielded them. The famous jurist Ulpian, for example, writing in the early 3rd century AD, specifically notes the established practice of referring capital cases, serious crimes carrying the death penalty involving decurions.
Those are the local town councilors, the regional elite.
Exactly. Cases involving them were often referred directly to the emperor for review or decision. It was a clear mechanism reinforcing their protected status, ensuring local justice couldn't easily touch the well-connected.
This legal disparity obviously reflected a wider social reality. Wealth and patronage were everything.
Massively so. You see the wealthy Roman elite, particularly senators and equestrians, just getting richer and richer. A primary way was by investing heavily in agricultural land, especially in Italy, consolidating vast estates, the latifundia.
And this had knock-on effects.
Devastating ones. This concentration of land systematically pushed out the small-scale citizen farmers, the very backbone of the early Republic's army. They simply couldn't compete economically.
What happened to them?
They were displaced. Many were forced to migrate to the city of Rome, swelling the ranks of the urban poor, dependent on handouts. Or their only other option was often to join the professionalized army, ironically serving the empire that had, in effect, taken their land.
There's a really stark irony there that our sources pick up on, isn't there?
A profound one. That many of the very men hailed as the conquerors of the world, the Roman citizen soldiers who built the empire, found themselves ejected from their own ancestral farms, displaced often by the very people they had conquered, and who were now enslaved to work the massive estates owned by the elite.
And this unchecked elite wealth, the huge land holdings, it even changed the physical landscape, didn't it? It became visible.
Yes, and it generated resentment. Some texts express real disapproval of these enormous aristocratic villa complexes that started dotting the Italian countryside.
Why the disapproval?
Because these villas became so huge, so elaborate, they started to blur the line between a private country house and a small town. Some even had features like imitation town walls or semi-public temples built on the grounds.
Like a private kingdom.
That's how it was perceived by some. This ostentatious display, this resemblance to a state within a state, felt sinister. It was a visible symbol of aristocratic power growing so vast it seemed to exceed proper civic boundaries.
This tension, this clash between established law and this kind of overweening elite power and corruption, it really boils over in some of the famous trials of the late Roman Republic. Cicero's prosecution of Verres is a prime example.
Gaius Verres, the former governor of Sicily. Yeah, Cicero took that case on explicitly positioning himself as the defender of the wronged provincials against Verres' absolute outrageous abuses.
What kind of abuses?
It was everything. Extortion, plundering art treasures, judicial corruption, extreme cruelty, just sheer greed and breathtaking insolence. The Sicilians themselves described his governorship as something beyond their power of endurance.
But for Cicero, the trial was about more than just Verres' personal guilt, wasn't it? There was a bigger political fear.
Absolutely. The truly fatal thing, the terrible thing, as Cicero argued passionately to the jury, wasn't just Verres getting away with his crimes. It was the certainty of what would happen if Verres was acquitted, likely through bribery or political pressure from his powerful senatorial friends.
Which was?
Verres would return to Rome not just unpunished, but empowered. He would be eligible, as a former praetor, to sit on the very senatorial juries that judged corruption cases and other major trials involving Roman citizens and officials.
So the fear wasn't just him escaping justice, it was him becoming justice.
That was the terrifying prospect. An obviously outrageously corrupt official, shielded by his wealth and connections, would then be in a position to control the fates and liberties of other Roman citizens from the judicial bench itself. It perfectly highlights Cicero's fear that if elite corruption couldn't be checked by the legal system, then the system itself would become invalidated, just another tool in the hands of the criminals. It threatened the very foundation of the Republic.
So we've really covered a lot of ground here, across centuries, across Greece and Rome, seeing how power, corruption, and the law itself were just constantly deeply intertwined.
Yeah, whether you're looking at Critias in Athens, using this very specific, almost bureaucratic loophole, just striking a name off a list to carry out a political execution.
Yeah, demonstrating just how fragile democratic laws could be when faced with that kind of ruthless self-interest.
Or you look at Rome, with its incredibly developed, almost obsessive legal culture. Yet that same system evolves to formally protect the wealthy and privileged honestiores, while gradually applying punishments once reserved only for slaves to the lower-class humiliores.
Even as the fortunes of that elite were being built on the displacement of the very citizens who'd conquered the empire for them.
It brings home that the struggle for justice, in so many of these cases, was really a struggle over reputation, over economic security, over legal status itself.
And the underlying lesson seems consistent, doesn't it? Whether it's the political murder in Athens or Cicero's dread about a corrupt Verres returning to judge others in Rome.
The core issue seems to be the failure to really reconcile these powerful forces: aristocratic ambition and patronage, the demands of military success, wealth concentration, reconciling all that with the necessary limits and structures of law.
It feels like the systems were constantly struggling to contain the very forces they actually relied on for their power and expansion.
Which ultimately, as we know, contributed to massive instability and eventually the collapse or transformation of these systems across the ancient world.
Now, we spent a good bit of time exploring that deep paradox of Roman slavery, how Roman law itself seemed to wrestle with defining free labor versus slave labor, citizen versus property.
And we brought in that powerful Stoic idea, influential among the elite. Remember that true slavery wasn't about legal status. It was internal, moral, being enslaved to your own desires, your passions.
Right, that legal bondage was just an external circumstance.
Which leaves us with a final, maybe provocative thought for you, the listener, to really chew on. It connects that high-minded philosophy back to the brutal, practical realities of power we've been discussing.
Okay, what is it?
If the philosophers argued that true slavery was internal, a moral state, then in whose name, or maybe more accurately, in whose fundamental interest, were the physical real-world laws actually being enforced? The laws regarding corporal punishment for slaves, the laws requiring testimony under torture from them. If it wasn't primarily for some abstract philosophical ideal about inner freedom, then was it simply for the cynical, cold, hard maintenance of power, profit, and social control by the elite?